There was a time when the land of Israel trembled, not because of earthquakes or storms. It trembled because of a voice, a single voice that thundered every morning and every evening between the hills of the valley of Elah, crawling like a rolling storm over the tents of the Israelite camp, slipping through every crack of every shelter, creeping into the ears of every soldier, every captain, every general. And that voice belonged to one man, a man who was not entirely a man. He was a mountain of flesh and bronze that walked on two legs. His name was Goliath, and he came from Gath. To understand what happened in that valley, you have to go back. You have to return to the moment when two nations stared into each other's eyes from opposing hillsides and knew that one of them would cease to exist. The Philistines, that warrior people who inhabited the southern coast of Canaan, had gathered their armies for war. This was no border skirmish. This was no midnight raid to steal cattle. This was a total mobilization. Thousands of soldiers marched from the 5 Philistine cities, from Gaza, from Ashdod, from Ashkelon, from Ekron, and from Gath. They concentrated their forces at Soko, which belonged to Judah, and camped between Soko and Azekah in a place called Ephes Damim. That name in ancient Hebrew meant border of blood, and blood was about to flow. On the other side, Saul gathered the men of Israel. They camped in the valley of Elah, a natural corridor between the lowlands and the mountains of Judea, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient terebinth trees. The Philistines occupied one hill. Israel occupied the hill across from it, and between the two armies, the valley, an open, barren stretch where the wind dragged dust and silence. No one crossed. No one moved. The war had stalled at a dead point, like two beasts watching each other before the pounce. But what came next would shatter every balance. Then a champion stepped out of the Philistine camp. The Hebrew word used to describe him was Ish Habanayim, the man of the middle, the warrior who represented his entire people in single combat. And that warrior was Goliath of Gath. The sacred text describes his height with precision. He measured 6 cubits and a span, nearly 10 feet tall. His head was covered by a polished bronze helmet that reflected the sunlight like an infernal crown. Over his torso, he wore a coat of scale armor, also made of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. More than 125 pounds of metal covering his chest, his sides, his back. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, protections that ran from his knees to his ankles. Between his shoulders he carried a bronze javelin, and in his right hand a spear whose shaft was as thick as a weaver's beam. The iron tip weighed 600 shekels, nearly 15 pounds of forged iron, capable of piercing any shield, any armor, any human body. Before him marched a shield-bearer carrying a shield the size of a door. Goliath was not merely a warrior, he was a war machine in human form, and he knew it. He planted himself in the middle of the valley. The sun struck his bronze, and flashes of light ricocheted toward both armies. He opened his mouth, and his voice was like the roar of an animal that does not exist in nature. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" he bellowed. "Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." He paused. The echo of his words bounced between the hills. Then he added, with a contempt you could taste in the air, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." Silence. Not a single Israelite soldier moved, not a captain, not a general, not even the king. Saul, the tallest man in all of Israel, the one who stood head and shoulders above every other Israelite, the one who had once been a fierce military leader, remained frozen inside his tent. The biblical text says it with a clarity that cuts like a blade. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and terrified. The Spirit of God had departed from Saul. And when the spirit left, courage left with it. The tallest king in Israel had become the greatest coward in Israel. And Goliath knew it. Every morning and every evening, for 40 days, the giant marched to the center of the valley and repeated his challenge. 40 dawns, 40 dusks, 80 times the same voice thundering against the same hills, 80 times the same silence in response. Fear had become something physical, something you could touch, something that weighed on the shoulders of every soldier like an invisible armor made of shame and paralysis. But what no one in that camp knew was that God had already set a plan in motion, and that plan did not involve any soldier. It did not involve any general. It did not involve the king. It involved a boy who at that very moment was miles away, tending sheep beneath the skies of Bethlehem. His name was David. He was the son of a man named Jesse, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in Judah, already old and advanced in years. Jesse had 8 sons. The 3 eldest, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, had marched off to war following Saul. But David was the youngest, the last, the one no one mentioned by name when important visitors arrived. Months earlier, the prophet Samuel had come to Bethlehem on a secret mission from God. He was to anoint a new king over Israel. Jesse presented his 7 older sons, one after another, each one taller, stronger, more impressive than the last. Samuel looked at Eliab, the firstborn, and thought surely this was the anointed one. But God spoke to the prophet's heart with words that would echo through the ages. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 7 sons passed. 7 times God said no. Samuel asked Jesse if he had any more sons, and the father's answer revealed how little he valued the youngest. There is still the smallest, he said, as if it were a detail hardly worth mentioning. He is out tending the sheep. Samuel ordered them to send for him, and when David walked in, his face reddened by the sun, and his eyes shining bright, God spoke, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Samuel poured the oil over the boy's head, and from that day forward the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. But David did not ascend to the throne that day. He went back to the sheep, he went back to the fields, he went back to the cold dawns and the lonely nights guarding his father's flock among the hills of Bethlehem. Those years were not wasted time, they were forging time. In those fields he learned to wield the sling with deadly precision. Every stone he launched at a wolf, at a jackal, at a serpent was a rehearsal for what was coming. Every night he faced the darkness alone was a lesson in faith that no human teacher could impart. David had killed lions. David had killed bears. He tore the prey from their mouths with his own hands. And when the beasts turned on him, he grabbed them by the jaw and struck them dead. He was no ordinary shepherd. He was a warrior in training, though no one knew it yet, not even he himself. And then came the day that changed everything. Jesse called David one morning and handed him a load, an ephah of roasted grain, 10 loaves of bread, and 10 cuts of cheese for the commander of their unit. The mission was simple: deliver provisions to the camp where his brothers were fighting the Philistines. Check on them. Bring back news. David rose very early, left the flock in the care of a keeper, loaded the supplies onto his shoulders, and set out toward the valley of Elah. He did not know he was walking toward his destiny. He did not know that every step was bringing him closer to the most important moment of his life. He walked for hours under the Judean sun, crossing dry hills, dusty trails, fields of cut wheat. And when he finally caught sight of the Israelite camp, what he saw stopped him cold. The army was marching out in battle formation, shouting the war cry. The two sides were lining up face to face, army against army. David left his supplies with the keeper of the baggage and ran toward the ranks to greet his brothers. The sound of thousands of sandals on dry earth, the clinking of armor, the tense murmur of men who knew they could die that day. David absorbed it all with eyes wide open like a child, seeing the ocean for the first time. And then he heard it. While he was talking with his brothers, a voice rose from the floor of the valley. A voice unlike any David had ever heard before. It was deep, guttural, dripping with contempt. Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, stepped out from the Philistine lines and spoke the same words he had been repeating for 40 days. The challenge, the mockery, the provocation. David turned his head toward the valley, and he saw him. The silhouette of the giant stood against the sky like a tower of bronze. The sun ripped flashes from his helmet, from his coat of mail, from the tip of his spear. His shield-bearer marched before him like a herald from the pit, and the reaction of the Israelites was instant. Every man of Israel who saw him fled from his presence and was overcome with dread. War veterans who had survived dozens of battles turned around and ran like frightened children. David watched them with a mixture of astonishment and outrage that lit something inside his chest, something that could not be put out. The soldiers whispered among themselves, "Have you seen this man who keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." David heard those words, but it was not the promise of riches that moved him. It was not the king's daughter. It was not the tax exemption. It was something far deeper, something that burned inside him like an ember that the wind fans into a blaze. David spoke to those standing near him with a voice that sounded far too steady for a boy his age. "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" No one had spoken those words in 40 days. No one had mentioned the living God in 40 days. No one had dared to call the giant what he was, an uncircumcised man who insulted the creator of the universe in 40 days. David had just arrived and had already said what an entire army had kept silent for over a month. But not everyone received his words with admiration. Eliab, his oldest brother, heard him and fury ignited across his face like a flame. He turned on David with narrowed eyes and a clenched jaw. "Why have you come down here?" he spat, his tone dripping with venom. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the wickedness of your heart. You came down only to watch the battle." Every word was a blow, every sentence an accusation. Eliab, the firstborn, the one Samuel had mistaken for the anointed one because of his towering stature, the one God had rejected in favor of his younger brother, unloaded onto David all the frustration, all the envy, all the shame that had built up over 40 days of cowardice. David looked at him. He did not back down. He did not lower his gaze. "What have I done now?" he replied with a calm that stood in stark contrast to his brother's storm. "Can I not even speak?" And he turned away from Eliab. He walked off and kept talking to other soldiers, asking the same things, speaking the same words that no one else dared to say. What his older brother had said to him stung, but he would not let that sting rob him of his conviction. David's words spread through the camp like wildfire across a dry field, from mouth to mouth, from tent to tent, until they reached the ears of one person, Saul. The king sent for the boy. David entered the royal tent, probably still dusted from the road, smelling of roasted grain and cheese, his hands calloused from years of shepherding, and his eyes burning with the fire of someone who has seen what others cannot. He looked the king of Israel in the face and spoke, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul looked him up and down. What he saw was a teenager, no armor, no military training, no battle scars. What he said was the response of a reasonable man. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. It was logical, it was sensible, it was entirely true from a human perspective. Goliath had spent decades killing men on battlefields. David had spent years tending sheep in pastures, but David did not operate from a human perspective. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep," David began. And his voice changed. It was no longer the voice of a boy asking for permission. It was the voice of someone presenting evidence before a court. "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its jaw, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear." He paused. He let the images settle in the king's mind. A boy alone at night in the open field, grabbing a lion by the jaw. A teenager ripping a sheep from the mouth of a bear. And then came the sentence that sealed everything. "This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Silence in the king's tent. Saul stared at him. Something in David's words struck a chord the king thought had died long ago. Perhaps it was the boy's pure faith. Perhaps it was the shame of knowing that a shepherd had more courage than his entire army. Perhaps it was the desperation of a man who knew he had nothing left to lose. "Go," Saul finally said, "and the Lord be with you." But before letting him go, Saul did something that revealed how little he understood about what was about to happen. He dressed David in his own military garments. He placed a bronze helmet on his head. He covered him with a coat of armor. He strapped his sword over the tunic. David tried to walk. He took 1, 2, 3 steps and stopped. The armor was enormous on him. The helmet slid down over his eyes. The sword knocked against his knees. He could not move. "I cannot go in these," David said as he removed each piece one by one, "because I am not used to them." And there lay the difference. Saul tried to dress David in the weapons of man, but David already carried the weapons of God. He did not need bronze. He did not need iron. He needed what he had always had: his sling, his stones, his faith. And then something happened that no one would ever forget. David walked out of the king's tent with his shepherd's staff in his hand. He descended toward the stream that ran along the floor of the valley of Elah. The water was clear and cold, fed by the rains from the mountains of Judea. He crouched down. He studied the stones at the bottom. He did not grab just any stone. He chose them. 5 smooth stones, rounded, the perfect size to fit in the leather pouch of his sling. Each stone had to be perfectly round, without flaws, with a uniform weight. Any imperfection would throw off the trajectory. David knew his sling the way a musician knows his instrument. He had launched thousands of stones in his lifetime, at wolves, at jackals, at lions. Each of those stones had been a rehearsal for this one. He placed the 5 stones in his shepherd's bag, gripped his sling, and began descending toward the center of the valley. The army of Israel watched him from the hillside. The army of the Philistines watched him from the other. 2 nations holding their breath as an unarmored teenager walked toward the most lethal man in the ancient world. If this story is touching your heart, subscribe now and hit the bell. Here, every narrative is a journey through the sacred pages. And what happens next in the story of David and Goliath will leave your heart pounding. Goliath saw David approaching, and what he felt was not fear, it was not concern, it was not even curiosity. It was contempt. The giant had been expecting a warrior. He had been expecting a man covered in iron, with scars on his face and dried blood on his hands. What he saw was a ruddy boy with fine features, his cheeks flushed by the sun, carrying a wooden staff and a leather pouch. Nothing more. The giant squinted. He looked to the left. He looked to the right. He searched for the real opponent. And when he realized that this child was all Israel had sent him, something dark ignited inside him. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Goliath bellowed. His voice bounced off the hills like a verbal earthquake. The shield-bearer marching before him halted and stared at the boy with a grimace of disbelief. Goliath raised his head toward the sky and cursed David by his gods. By Dagon, by Ashtoreth, by every Philistine deity his tongue could name, he called down destruction upon the teenager's head. "Come here," he roared, spreading his arms wide as if receiving prey, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David did not stop. He did not tremble. He did not lower his gaze. He kept walking toward the giant with the same calm he carried every dawn when walking toward his sheep. And when he was close enough for both armies to hear him, he opened his mouth. And what came out was not the stammering of a frightened boy. It was a declaration of spiritual warfare that shook the valley of Elah to its foundations. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David said. His voice was clear, firm, without a single tremor. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head." The words fell upon the valley like stones. "Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." No one was breathing. 2 entire armies. Thousands of men on both sides stood petrified. An unarmored teenager had just told the most feared warrior in the world that he would cut off his head. And he said it without flinching. He said it looking him straight in the eyes. He said it like someone who was not making a threat but announcing a fact. Goliath roared. Rage twisted his face. He rose and advanced toward David. The ground shook beneath his feet. Each step sent tremors through the earth. His shield-bearer darted to the side. The spear was raised. The giant's shadow fell over David like an eclipse. And then David did something no one expected. He ran. He did not run backward. He did not run sideways. He ran straight toward Goliath. The biblical text says it with a precision that takes your breath away. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. As he ran, his hand reached into his bag. His fingers found a stone. He placed it in the leather pouch of his sling. His feet did not stop. His arm began spinning the sling above his head. 1 rotation, 2 rotations, 3 rotations, 3. The sound of leather slicing through the air was the only thing that could be heard across the entire valley. The distance closed, 60 feet, 45 feet, 30 feet. Goliath raised his spear. His arm drew back like a bow. David released the cord. The stone shot from the pouch at a speed the human eye could barely follow. It crossed the space between the 2 combatants in a fraction of a second, and it found its mark, the giant's forehead, right between the eyes, right where the helmet left a strip of exposed skin. The stone sank into the bone. It did not bounce. It did not graze. It embedded itself. The impact was so brutal that the brain of the greatest warrior in the ancient world shut down like a candle, snuffed by the wind. Goliath's eyes flew wide open. His mouth twisted into a grimace that was no longer fury, but absolute astonishment. The spear fell from his hand. His knees buckled, and that monumental body, that mountain of bronze and muscle that had terrorized an entire nation for 40 days, collapsed forward. He fell face down. His face struck the earth. The impact sent up a cloud of dust that rose toward the sky like the smoke of a sacrifice. Silence. A silence so deep you could hear the wind dragging dust across the fallen body of the giant. 2 armies, thousands of men, staring in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. And then David moved. He ran toward Goliath's body. He reached him. He stood over him, the teenager standing on top of the fallen mountain. He searched for the giant's sword. He found it in its sheath. He grabbed it with both hands. It was enormous, heavy, forged for an arm 3 times the size of his own, but David lifted it. He drew it from its sheath. The sound of iron scraping against leather tore through the silence of the valley, and with a single stroke that combined the force of adrenaline with the precision of someone who had butchered wild beasts with his bare hands, David brought the sword down on Goliath's neck. The giant's head separated from his body. Blood soaked the earth of the valley of Elah, and David lifted it. He raised it with his arm fully extended, gripping it by the hair, displaying it to both armies like a trophy that screamed a truth that words could not contain. The invincible giant had been beheaded by a teenager with a stone and a shepherd's sling. What followed was chaos. The Philistines saw that their champion was dead. The man in whom they had placed all their confidence, the warrior who was supposed to be invincible, lay headless in the dust. They had agreed to submit to Israel if their champion lost. But the Philistines were not people of their word. Instead of surrendering, they did the only thing left. They fled. They turned around and ran. Thousands of Philistine warriors running in a stampede, throwing down their weapons, stumbling over one another, shoving each other in a frenzy of pure terror. And then Israel awoke. The same men who had trembled for 40 days, the same soldiers who ran every time Goliath appeared, the same warriors who had remained paralyzed by fear, rose to their feet. A war cry erupted from the Israelite hillside. It was not the cry of thousands of individual throats. It was a single roar that shook the entire valley. The men of Israel and Judah charged forward. They chased the Philistines all the way to the gates of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. The entire road from Sharaim was littered with Philistine corpses. Those who had fled from one giant now pursued an entire army. The cowardice of 40 days became a crushing victory in a single afternoon. And when the chase was over, the sons of Israel returned and plundered the Philistine camp. David took the head of Goliath and brought it to Jerusalem. The giant's weapons he kept in his own tent. That sword, which had served to sever the head of its own master, now belonged to the boy who had wielded it with hands stained with blood and dust. Later, that same sword would be kept behind the ephod in the tabernacle as a perpetual testimony of what God had done that day in the valley of Elah. Saul, who had watched everything from the hillside, turned to Abner, the commander of his army, as David descended into the valley. "Abner," the king said, "whose son is this young man?" And Abner, the supreme commander of Israel's forces, the man who should have known every warrior in the kingdom, answered with an honesty that revealed just how invisible David had been until that moment. "As surely as you live, your majesty, I do not know." When David returned from the battlefield, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. The boy still carried the Philistine's head in his hand. Blood dripped onto the floor of the royal tent. Saul looked into his eyes and asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered with the simplicity of someone who still did not grasp the magnitude of what he had just done. "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem, the son of an elderly shepherd from Bethlehem, the youngest of 8 brothers, the one who had not even been invited to the sacrifice when Samuel came to anoint the next king, the one his own father described as the one who is left, the one with the sheep, as though he were an afterthought." That boy had just done what no soldier, no captain, no general, and no king of Israel had dared to do for 40 days. That boy had just changed the history of a nation with a stone, a sling, and a faith that could not fit inside any human armor. The victory in the valley of Elah was not merely a battle won. It was a cosmic declaration that echoed through the centuries and still echoes to this day. David did not defeat Goliath because he was stronger. He did not win because he was more skilled. He did not win because he had better weapons. He won because he understood something that an entire army had forgotten. The battle is the Lord's. Those 4 words carried more power than all of Goliath's bronze armor, more power than the 5,000 shekels of his coat of mail, more power than the 600 shekels of iron on the tip of his spear. The battle is the Lord's. David did not go into the valley of Elah to fight his own war. He went to defend the honor of a God who had been insulted for 40 days without a single soul speaking up. And this is where the story stops being an ancient tale and becomes a mirror. Everyone has a Goliath. Everyone faces a giant that plants itself before them morning and evening and screams that they are too small, too weak, too insignificant to overcome it. It could be an illness the doctors say is incurable. It could be a debt that seems impossible to repay. It could be an addiction that has ruled every decision for years. It could be a broken relationship that no one believes can be restored. It could be fear. It could be depression. It could be the loneliness that howls in the silence of the early hours when no one is listening. That is your Goliath. And it has been standing in front of you for days, weeks, months, perhaps years, defying you, mocking you, telling you that you will never be free. But hear closely what happened in the valley of Elah. David did not wait until he was ready. He did not wait for the perfect armor. He did not wait to be bigger, stronger, more experienced. He walked into the valley with what he had: a shepherd's sling, 5 stones from the stream, and an unshakable faith in a God who had never abandoned him. The stone that brought down Goliath was not magical. It had no special powers. It was an ordinary stone from the bottom of a stream in Judea, but in the hand of someone who trusts God, an ordinary stone becomes the most powerful weapon in the universe. David did not defeat the giant with strength. He defeated him with faith. He did not overcome him with military strategy. He overcame him with radical obedience. He did not need Saul's armor because he already had the protection of God. And that protection never fails. It never weighs too much. It never fits too large or too small. It fits perfectly on the one who wears it because it was designed by the same God who designed the one who needs it. The story of David and Goliath is not merely a story of human bravery. It is the most dramatic demonstration of a truth that runs through all of Scripture from beginning to end. God does not look for the strongest. He looks for the most faithful. He does not look for the most prepared by the world's standards. He looks for those who are willing to walk into the valley with the little they have and trust that He will do the rest. God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. An elderly shepherd had 8 sons, and God chose the last one, the forgotten one, the one out with the sheep. An entire army trembled before a giant, and God used the only one who did not tremble, the boy who was not even a soldier. Today, as you listen to these words, there is a valley waiting for you. There is a giant shouting your name. There is a stone in your hand. You do not need to be the strongest person in the room. You do not need to have all the answers. You do not need the world to believe in you. You only need to believe in the same God who guided that stone through the air above the valley of Elah, sank it into the forehead of a 10-foot monster, and proved before 2 armies that no giant, absolutely no giant, is too big for the God of Israel. The battle is the Lord's. It always has been, it always will be. And sometimes God does not remove the giant from your path. He gives you the stone to bring it down. If this story touched your heart, write in the comments, "My giants fall today."